6. Swimming with the sharks. Sarah gazed in shock and revulsion at the remains of the whatever on the table. "I know some kids are ugly," she said weakly, "but that's a bit extreme, don't you think?" "Extreme and extremely immoral," agreed the doctor. "It's perversion of the natural order on a scale I've seen only once before." "But there's no way that thing could be a 10-year-old child," objected Sarah. "It isn't. At least, it isn't anymore." The doctor was very grim, and she could detect the undercurrent of moral outrage below his surface. "But that's how the poor creature began." Doyle, wiping his hands after having washed them thoroughly, walked over to join them. "Even I don't understand how it has been accomplished," he admitted. "But there's no doubting the doctor's core theory. That is not some animal." Sarah shook her head. "Look, I know I'm not really up on the science stuff, but I'm no dummy either. It's impossible to create hybrids of humans and animals, isn't it?" "Generally speaking, yes," agreed the doctor. "But this isn't general. It's very specific. Without access to much more sophisticated analysis techniques, I can't be too sure what's happened, but the basics are fairly clear. The body structure of that creature is that of a normal human child. Somehow, though, his genetic material has been melded with that of a canine, possibly a wolf, most likely a dog of some kind." Sarah frowned. "Come off it," she said. "Are you telling me that thing's an honest-to-God werewolf?" "It's not honest to anything, Sarah Jane," the doctor said hollowly. "It's as dishonest as they come. And it's not a werewolf in the sense you imagine. This is a deliberately engineered monstrosity." "Somebody made a kid into that?" Sarah was appalled beyond any words. "Yes." The doctor spoke quietly but firmly. "The genetic match isn't too good, and the poor creature must have been in pain constantly, and probably more than half insane." "But that's not possible in this time period, is it, Doctor?" she insisted. "Time period?" Doyle's eyes went wide. "What the deuce are you talking about?" "Later," the doctor snapped at him. To Sarah, he said, "No, it isn't, which means that we're dealing with something intrusive. That kind of genetic manipulation won't be possible on this planet for at least 200 years. "Then what is happening here?" demanded Sarah. "One possibility is that we have an intruder from the future." That sparked something in Sarah's mind. "Wait a minute. I just met someone who seems to be a bit too aware of what the future might bring." She told the doctor and Doyle about her visit to the factory. "Is it possible that Breckinridge is from the future, and that he's come back to this time to alter the course of history? That he aims to get rich when the communications boom comes in a couple of years?" "It's possible," agreed the doctor. "I don't know how likely it is, though. Aside from his ideas, which a shrewd businessman of this time could still come up with, and this pitiful beast, there's nothing to suggest time travel." "That's it," said Doyle firmly. "I refuse to be shut out of this conversation any longer. Will you two please tell me what you're discussing here? Time travel?" That had sunk it. Sarah sighed. "Look," she said, "it's very complicated, and I know you won't believe it. So let it drop, okay?" But Doyle was having none of that. "Wait a moment," he insisted. "The only way that what you have both been saying makes any sense is if you claim to be from a different time period to this. The future, I assume, and you have somehow transferred back in time. Is that what you are claiming?" "We're claiming nothing," Sarah replied. "Let it drop, please." "Oh, no," Doyle said firmly. "You can't just raise the idea and then walk away from it. The very concept is preposterous." "It is it?" asked the doctor. "Yes, of course it is." Doyle waved his hands about his head. "One cannot simply move freely back and forth between the ages. I'm a rational man, and I accept only those matters that science can demonstrate to a rational man." "Then heaven defend us from rational men," the doctor yelled. "A pox on rationality. Has it never occurred to you that the human understanding of science is a small and pitiful thing? That there might exist vast areas outside of human knowledge that can still be explained scientifically, but not in terms of the puny knowledge that the human race possesses at this time? That there just might be realities undescribed by and unknown to your limited grasp of science? A rational man? Ha!" "Well," said Doyle, somewhat taken aback by this verbal assault, "if you choose to put it like that—" "I do so choose," the doctor replied. "Then I have to say that you are correct, Doctor." Doyle shook his head slowly. "It is arrogant to assume that everything we know is everything there is to know." "Congratulations," Sarah informed him. "You've just made a huge step forward. Ignorance isn't so bad, but refusing to see ignorance is. But I still find it hard to accept the notion of transference in time," Doyle added honestly. The doctor gestured at the carcass on the table. "Then merely accept it. You've seen it, you've touched it, and you helped me to dissect it. Explain that in terms of 19th century knowledge." "I cannot." "Good. I'd have called you a damned fool and a liar if you tried." The doctor patted him encouragingly on the back. "Well, let's get a pot of tea and some scones, shall we? I do hope they have clotted cream and strawberry jam." "You're just leaving that where it is?" asked Sarah, jerking her thumb at the corpse. "You're welcome to bury it if you wish," the doctor told her, "but I thought we'd do better leaving that to the local vicar." He set off back towards the hall briskly. Falling in beside him, Sarah asked, "What's next on the agenda, after afternoon tea?" "I wonder if we can hire a boat." "A boat?" asked Doyle, struggling to keep up. "Whatever for?" "I feel like a spot of fishing," the doctor replied. Sarah grinned. "Let me guess. You want to see what's out at sea." "You know me so well, Sarah Jane." Here, I say," objected Doyle. "Isn't that likely to be a trifle dangerous, given what happened to old Tolliver?" "No," the doctor replied. "It's likely to be very dangerous. You needn't accompany me." "You'll need my help," Doyle insisted. "I'm a decent hand with a harpoon, you know, and a fair shot." "And you'd better not even dream about leaving me behind," added Sarah. The doctor gave her a wide grin. "There's no one I'd sooner have beside me," he assured her. "I knew you'd never stay behind." "You know me so well, Doctor." "That's a damn strange request, even for you, Doyle." Captain John Gray stared at his ship's surgeon in surprise. "The loan of a harpoon? There are no whales in these waters, man." Sarah rather liked the gruff old seaman. His receding hair was a wiry grey, matching his name, and his spade-like beard was full and thick. There was the tinge of a Scottish burr to his words, but no mistaking his puzzlement. "I understand that, Captain," agreed Doyle, "but there is some kind of creature in the bay that killed a fisherman a couple of nights back." "And what the blazes are you doing going after it?" Gray gave a grim smile. "Wait till the morning and half the crew would volunteer to accompany you on a hunt." "I suspect this beat only emerges at night, Captain," the doctor offered, "and I doubt your men would be willing to indulge in a spot of night fishing." Gray snorted. "After a day in port, they're in no shape to even stir this night." "Besides," added Doyle, "we may well not be attacked at all. The harpoon is merely for defence." "Oh, very well," Gray agreed. "I know you can use it, man, but be careful. You're a good shipmate, and I'd hate to have to bury you." "I assure you we will take every precaution," the doctor replied. Incidentally, when do you sail?" "Tomorrow morning or the next," Gray answered. "Ah," the doctor nodded. "Then your business transaction with Mr. Breckinridge has concluded." Gray looked surprised again. "Aye, that it has. What concern is it of yours?" "Possibly none," admitted the doctor candidly. "But might I presume to inquire as to the nature of the business?" "You may not," thundered Gray, getting to his feet. "It is of a private concern and no affair of yours, you impudent wretch." "Captain," Doyle said hastily, moving between the two, "the doctor is from Scotland Yard and is aiding the local police in solving 2 or 3 very mysterious cases. It is possible that Mr. Breckinridge may have some connection with one or more of the cases." "A suspect?" growled Gray. "Breckinridge has been an honourable man and dealt fairly with me." "He may be innocent," Sarah said gently. There was no point in clarifying Doyle's erroneous assumption of the doctor's standing. "But a little help from you could clear his name." Gray shook his head. "I promised him that our transaction would remain our secret. Something to do with industrial espionage or something." Sarah nodded. "Not a job offer, then, piloting a cable-laying ship?" "Good Lord, no!" Gray looked amused. "Whoever told you that must be completely out their heads. What would an old whaler like me do piloting a cable ship?" "What indeed?" asked the doctor cheerfully. He shook the captain's hand. "Thank you. You've been more than helpful." "My pleasure." Gray shook his head in bemusement as they left his cabin. "A cable layer," he muttered. "Me. These police chappies are all mad." As they passed onto the deck, Sarah smiled at the doctor. "So we know that Breckinridge lied about one thing at the very least." "But nothing more," the doctor chided her. "Gray's story of Breckinridge being wary about industrial spying could well be true. There's a lot of it about, and their deal could well be honest." "I'm certain that it would have to be, from the captain's side at least," Doyle offered, as he selected a harpoon and began to coil the rope about his arm. "Gray is one of the straightest, most decent men I've ever met." "I'm sure he must be." The doctor stared out over the gentle seas. "A perfect night for a sail, isn't it? Hardly a swell in sight." "And where are we going to get a boat from?" asked Sarah. "This is a fishing town," the doctor replied. "The place is littered with them." "We can't just take one," argued Sarah. "I wasn't going to." The doctor led them off the Hope again and back along the quay. "Tolliver's boat is still moored behind the Pig and Thistle," he explained. "He won't be having much use for it, seeing as they buried him today." "Constable Faversham might consider it stealing." "Faversham is guarding the grave tonight," the doctor countered, "in case the robbers show up again. I'm inclined to let him. I doubt the villains are stupid enough to strike on the night of the burial. They waited last time, and they will undoubtedly wait again." He flashed Sarah a grin. "And I aim to tell Mr. Brackley that we're just borrowing the boat for the evening and pay him to alert anyone who asks." "He'll just get blotted," said Sarah. "All the better. Then he's not likely to object, is he?" He didn't. When the doctor flipped him a shilling, the one-armed sailor promised to keep a watch out for anyone asking after them. Sarah noticed that he was apparently aiming to spend the vigil warm and well lubricated, since he shot into the tavern before the 3 of them had even cast off the moorings of the small fishing boat. "Are you familiar with these boats?" Doyle asked the doctor. "I'm familiar with all boats from coracles to catamarans," the doctor answered, slipping free the fore rope and jumping down to the deck. "Or do I have to tie a sheath of sheepshanks to prove it?" "I'll take your word for it." "Good." The doctor and Sarah raised the sail, while Doyle watched the wheel. Sarah stared out across the bay. The main fishing fleet had departed earlier to get well out to sea where the fishing would begin. That meant, at least, that there was no chance of a collision in the bay. Sarah was no great shakes on a boat. it hadn't been a terribly realistic option in South Croydon. She had done a little sailing, and did know that the pointy end of the boat went first, and that sailors insisted on port and starboard instead of left and right like normal human beings. After that, she was lost. At least it was looking like a calm night. That meant her stomach might well behave itself. She had never actually been seasick in her life, but tonight would not have been a good time to start. Still, with the sun low on the horizon, it looked like being a calm and beautiful night. The wind that had nipped at her last night had died down, and there was just a light breeze to fill the sail and carry them slowly and gently along. The clouds were sporadic, and stars were already starting to twinkle. She wished that this were simply some pleasure cruise, and that there was a packed picnic hamper and a bottle of some feisty plonk instead of harpoons, rifles, and nets aboard. Wouldn't it be lovely to actually be able to enjoy things for a change, instead of having to fight or hide from things? Or would that just be normal and boring for her now? Sarah glanced up at the doctor and saw the light of excitement in his eyes. How he must have been bored as one of those stuffy, legalistic Time Lords back on his homeworld of Gallifrey. No wonder he enjoyed meddling so much. He was making up for more lost time than Sarah could ever begin to imagine. She began to sing softly, "Blow the man down, bullies, blow the man down." "Hey ho," the doctor agreed. Standing on the headland close to Breckenridge's factory, Ross surveyed the bay through his collapsible binoculars. "It's hard to see clearly in this light," he commented, "but that small fishing smack down there has 3 people aboard. One of them is definitely this doctor, and the other 2 are probably Miss Smith and that Dr. Doyle from the whaler." "So what?" asked Abercrombie, munching on a cheese and chutney sandwich he'd liberated on the way there. "I wonder how much they know about our business. That's what." Abercrombie shrugged. "What's the difference?" he asked. "If they're out there in the bleeding bay, then they don't know much, and they won't be alive long enough to learn more, will they?" Ross sighed. "It's a pity, Abercrombie," he said, "but I fear you are quite correct. Sadly, the doctor and his friends are likely to have a very lethal boating accident this evening." Once the doctor decided that they were far enough out in the bay, he and Doyle dropped the sail and let out the water anchor. "Now we just wait," he said. "So, who brought the cards?" asked Sarah. Doyle couldn't resist a smile at her easy manner. "Do you two do this kind of thing often?" he inquired. "Too bloomin' often," Sarah answered. "We do have a knack of walking into trouble," the doctor admitted. "Walking?" Sarah laughed. "Running headlong, more like." She grinned at the medical man. "You really wouldn't believe some of the adventures we've had." "Try me," suggested Doyle. Sarah shook her head. "No, I mean it. You really wouldn't believe them. If you think the idea that we might be from another time is hard to accept, you should try taking the doctor's pulse sometime." "I should?" "No, you shouldn't," the doctor snapped. "I'm in perfect health, as you can see. Sarah, stop trying to cause trouble." "Me? Cause trouble?" she asked in mock innocence. She simply couldn't resist baiting the doctor at times. "I suppose sitting out here in a tiny boat at night with an unknown killer is playing it safe." "It's as safe as I could make it," the doctor answered. "But I need some answers to too many questions, and this is the only place to get them." Sarah stared over the surface of the sea. The sun had gone down now, and the doctor had vetoed the idea of burning a lantern, wanting to stay out of sight of possible observers. Stars sprinkled across the blackness were also reflected choppily in the waters below. They were the only lights visible, and it was like being afloat in space. And then, "Doctor," she hissed, not wanting to raise her voice too loudly. Both doctors joined her in the bows, and they all stared out into the depths. Far below the boat, lights were visible in the water that were definitely not stars. There was a greenish tint to them, though that could be nothing more than the water casting a hue to white lights. There were hundreds of these lights, spread in a gigantic cartwheel-like shape. The hub of this wheel was several hundred yards to the left, port, of the small boat. As Sarah stared in awe and astonishment at the shape, she could see that it was slowly turning. "What is that?" she asked, spellbound. "I've heard about phenomena like this," Doyle answered her just as gently. "It's phosphorescence of some kind, as I understand it. There are minute sea creatures that glow in the night and live in colonies of thousands of individuals." "And they're all big fans of Wagon Train," the doctor scoffed. "Doyle, those minute sea animals live in much warmer waters than these, and they certainly aren't organised in regular battalions. That's not a natural phenomenon." "Then what is it?" asked Doyle, somewhat peevishly. "I'm not entirely sure," the doctor replied evasively. "Then be a little uncertain." "Offhand, I'd say it was some kind of activity taking place on the seabed," the doctor frowned, "and one controlled by considerable intelligence." Sarah snorted. "Oh, right. Davy Jones is a little restless tonight, so he's holding a dance." The doctor shook his head. Sarah, he chided. "I expect incredulity from Doyle. After all, he's a rational man. But I had hoped for better from you. After all, you're a journalist." "Thanks a heap." Sarah couldn't take her eyes from the slow, majestic movement of lights. She couldn't even begin to imagine what it was. "Are you suggesting that there's somebody down there right now doing that? In 1880? "Yes." "But how? The submarine hasn't been invented yet." "Actually, it has," the doctor contradicted her. "Simply not developed yet. But I don't think that what we're seeing is native to this time, or perhaps native to this world." Doyle gave an inarticulate cry. "This is getting too preposterous," he protested. "That's the second time you've mentioned some kind of intrusion from another era, and now you also imply that this anomalous phenomenon might be the product of some otherworldly forces." "Forget your preconceived notions, Doyle," thundered the doctor. He gestured over the bows of the boat. "Use your rationality to explain that if you can. If not, shut up and listen to wiser heads than yours." Doyle subsided, but Sarah could tell that he wasn't at all happy at whatever thoughts were passing through his mind. She could hardly blame them. The notion of time travel and alien intruders must be horribly far-fetched to him. Even his character of Professor Challenger hadn't faced quite this kind of puzzle, and he wouldn't create that irritable man of science for years yet. Sarah stared out at the waters and smiled. "I don't know what is causing it," she admitted, "but it's very pretty." There was also something vaguely familiar about the lights, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Pretty isn't a scientific term," the doctor said softly. Then he grinned. "But it is accurate. It's like a Christmas tree under water, isn't it?" "Perhaps we should be a little more cautious," Doyle suggested, "in leaning out to observe those lights. After all, Tolliver was obviously looking over the side of the boat when he was attacked." The doctor appeared astonished at the thought. "My dear chap," he cried, "of course. That's exactly what must have happened. He saw these lights, then leaned over for a better look, and—" Sarah and Doyle both dragged the doctor away from the gunwale as he looked set to reenact the accident. "We may be safer here," Sarah said, with a thankful nod at Doyle. "Smart thinking." "I knew what I was doing," the doctor said peevishly. "There was no need for that." "Whatever you say," Sarah agreed. She could still see the wheel turning slowly below the water, though not as clearly. The surface of the water was starting to get choppy, breaking up the image. "This is all very—" Doyle began. The boat gave a shudder as something slammed into it from below. It heaved in the water and twisted, falling back with a crash. Sarah, caught completely off guard, skidded across the small deck and into the gunwale. She barely had time to yelp from the pain to her shins when the boat was rammed a second time from underneath, and it gave another lurch. Arms failing wildly, Sarah attempted unsuccessfully to regain her balance. She heard the doctor cry out, and then she was falling. The water was cold and hard as she splashed down into it. The force of the impact stunned her, and she felt herself going under. At least she'd taken a gulp of air as she'd fallen, and she held her breath as she sank into the inky, frozen depths. As soon as she could move, she started to stroke with her hands, slowing her descent. Her clothing was thoroughly wet. The Victorian dress, long and flowing, had been so impractical on the surface. Here, waterlogged, she was afraid it would drag her down to her death. Frantically, she tried to stroke back toward the surface, but it was too hard. It felt as if an icy hand was dragging her down to her doom. "My God!" exclaimed Doyle, badly shaken but managing to retain his grip on the mast. "What the devil was that?" "Something rammed us from below," the doctor growled, fighting to stay on his feet. "Sarah! Sarah!" Doyle's eyes whipped around. "She must have gone overboard," he exclaimed. He started to move toward the side. "No," the doctor ordered. "That's what those creatures want us to do. Then they'll attack." "Let them," Doyle growled. He picked up his harpoon and hefted it. "They'll get a taste of cold steel if they attack me." "But what about your friend?" The doctor appeared ashen. "They're most likely going after her." He shucked off the capecoat and tossed the deerstalker on it. "I'm going after her." "They'll kill you," Doyle said in horror. "They can try," the doctor growled, "but I'm harder to kill than I look." Before Doyle could say anything else, the doctor sprang onto the gunwale and then executed a clean dive into the darkness beyond. Doyle shook his head and staggered across to the side. The harpoon was cold and familiar in his hand. If any of those monsters came after him, they'd get a fight. And if somehow the doctor or Miss Smith survived, Doyle could help them regain the boat. Slowly sinking, Sarah struggled with her encumbering clothing, trying to either shed it or rip it free. But it was no use at all. She couldn't manage, and her lungs were almost bursting. Then there was a sudden movement in the water. She felt something like a pressure wave slam into her. A dark shape grazed her, and she felt fire in her left hand as something raked across it. She could barely restrain a scream of pain, and the attacker was gone. She'd only caught a glimpse of it, but it had seemed to be some huge seal, and it had to be coming back. There was agony in her hand, and she knew that the beast had been toying with her. It could have killed her, but had instead just bitten her. The next time it might go for the kill, or for another wounding. She saw movement again as something approached her. It was hard to make out between the darkness and the blotches in her eyes from the strain and pain, but this shape appeared to be very different. She could make out a tail and what seemed to be hands. Struggling to get out of the way of this fresh attack, she flailed about without much effort. Then the creature came in closer. It was incredible. This was not her attacker. It looked like a young girl, perhaps 12 or so, with long, light hair floating like a halo around her head. She smiled encouragingly and gripped Sarah's uninjured arm. Sarah, struggling to stay conscious, was too astounded to know what to do. The girl seemed quite at ease, if she were real and not some nightmare of the deeps, and she gripped Sarah's skirt. She bent her head and bit at the fabric. Her teeth must have been made of steel or something similar, because they cut through the skirt without effort, and the girl ripped the rest of it free. A huge weight fell away from Sarah, and she stroked out with her hands. She felt herself rising at last, and then the gentle pressure of the girl's arms helping her. Sarah wondered what had happened to the monster that had attacked her, but concentrated on heading for the surface. As she did so, she saw another form close in suddenly. She had no energy left to fight it off. And then she felt the doctor grab her arm tightly and saw his face close beside hers. He smiled encouragingly. The girl was gone in a flicker of motion. Sarah wasn't certain, but it looked like the girl had left by flicking a tail and charging away at an incredible speed. She had no strength left to wonder, though, and all she could concentrate on was reaching the surface once again. And then she was there, bursting back out of the icy water into the cold night air. She emptied her lungs in a single burst and whooped in a fresh breath. She choked a little, but the fire in her head and chest started to die down. The doctor still supported her, and Sarah could see as she took another gulp of air that they were quite close to the boat. "Chin up, Sarah," the doctor gasped encouragingly. "Almost there." She nodded and put her strength into stroking out toward the boat. The pain in her left hand was almost unbearable, but she had to get out of the water as soon as possible before... There was a wake in the water as something threw itself toward her and the doctor. It was the creature that had attacked her before, sleek, dark, and deadly, coming in for the kill. Sarah didn't have the strength to fight it off, but she freed herself from the doctor's grip so that he might have a chance, and something whipped past her head, missing her by only feet. Belatedly, she realised it had been the harpoon. Doyle must have thrown it. The slim blade whipped through the air and slammed into the approaching creature. The beast's own speed helped drive the weapon home. Sarah heard a scream and a thrashing in the water, and the rope almost sang as it went taut. "Got it!" she heard Doyle yell. "And I've got Sarah," the doctor called up to Doyle. "Haul that thing in." Sarah managed to make it back to the boat. The doctor was floating there, holding on to a rope. She managed a small smile at him as he helped her up from the water to the side of the boat. It was a fight, but she managed to struggle aboard. She could barely use her left hand, and saw that it was badly skinned and still bleeding. Ignoring it, she turned to help the doctor back aboard. Doyle was concentrating on reeling in his catch. The harpoon was sticking up from the water at an angle, glittering in the light of a lantern Doyle had blazing. Sarah could see he had pierced some dark beast, very seal-like but huge. As she bent to offer the doctor her good hand to help him aboard, she saw an explosion of water close to the monster. A second creature leaped from the sea, and its large, teeth-packed snout ripped at the line to the harpoon. Doyle gave a cry, falling backwards as the line parted. There was a splash as the second beast fell back into the cold waters, and the dead creature sank beneath the waves. Sarah felt the doctor grab her hand, and he hauled himself over the side. There was another shock as something hit the boat right where he had been. "Thank you, Sarah," the doctor gasped, regaining his feet. "That thing almost had me." Doyle staggered across the small deck to them. "It got away!" he howled angrily. The doctor grinned. "I think you've lost your deposit on the harpoon," he agreed. "And I trust this attack is over. Would you mind taking a look at Sarah? I think she's injured her hand." Sarah was propped up against the side of the boat. She was shivering, partly from shock, partly from the soaking, and partly from the fact that she had no clothing left from a foot below her waist. She looked at her left hand, which still bled very badly, and then up at Doyle. "Oh dear," she gasped, and lost consciousness completely.